Why did King Edward VIII abdicate the throne? In the long and storied history of the British monarchy, few events have shaken the very foundations of the crown as deeply as the abdication of King Edward VIII. It was the winter of 1936 when, for the first and only time in modern British history, a reigning monarch voluntarily gave up the throne, not because of conquest, revolution, or illness, but because of love. At the heart of this extraordinary story lies a relationship that captivated the world, scandalized high society, and forced a centuries-old institution to confront its limits. To truly understand why King Edward VIII abdicated, one must first understand the man himself, his upbringing, his desires, and his disdain for the rigid traditions of the monarchy. Edward, known to his family as David, was the eldest son of King George V and Queen Mary. From birth he was groomed for kingship, yet his temperament clashed with the heavy expectations placed upon him. Unlike his father, who was stern, dutiful, and traditional, Edward was charismatic, fashionable, and deeply restless. He enjoyed the glamour of high society, the company of glamorous women, and the pleasures of a fast-paced lifestyle. He was adored by the public for his good looks and charm, but behind closed doors, his behavior often alarmed those who knew the strict duties of monarchy. It was in the late 1920s that Edward's life took a fateful turn. He met a woman named Wallis Simpson, an American socialite, who was married, sophisticated, and unlike anyone in the conservative royal circle. Wallis was witty, assertive, and completely unafraid to speak her mind, a sharp contrast to the demure and obedient women usually seen at court. For Edward, who longed for excitement and emotional connection, Wallis became irresistible. Their relationship deepened quickly, despite the obvious complications. By the early 1930s, Wallis had divorced her first husband and married a second, Ernest Simpson, a British-American businessman. Yet her connection with Edward grew stronger until it blossomed into a full love affair. The Prince of Wales, as he was then, was smitten. He introduced Wallis into his intimate circle, invited her to royal functions, and was often seen in public with her, something that went against all expectations of royal discretion. For the British establishment, and particularly for the government, this was deeply troubling. It was one thing for the heir to the throne to enjoy private company, but another for him to openly flaunt a relationship with a married woman. For the monarchy, which symbolized morality, stability, and Christian values, this was a scandal waiting to explode. In January 1936, Edward's father, King George V, passed away, and Edward became King Edward VIII. At just 41 years old, he was now the sovereign of the world's most powerful empire, ruling over Britain and its vast dominions. Yet within months of his reign, it became clear that Edward was not like his predecessors. He was impatient with protocol, skeptical of the advice of his ministers, and far more interested in spending time with Wallis than attending to the ceremonial duties of the crown. Still, what alarmed the government most was not his lack of discipline, but his determination to make Wallis his queen. The obstacle was monumental. Wallis was in the process of divorcing her second husband, and divorce at that time was not only frowned upon, but carried immense stigma, especially within the Church of England. As supreme governor of the Church, Edward was expected to uphold its teachings, which did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons if their former spouse was still alive. Wallis had not just one, but two living ex-husbands. For the Archbishop of Canterbury and the moral guardians of the realm, the prospect of this twice-divorced American becoming queen was utterly unacceptable. The crisis quickly escalated into what became known as the Abdication crisis. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin and his government informed Edward in no terms uncertain that marrying Wallis as king was impossible. They argued it would damage the moral authority of the monarchy, divide the empire, and undermine public confidence. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, also made their objections clear. The choice Edward faced was stark: Wallis or the throne. For Edward, the decision was never really in doubt. He had always resented the constraints of monarchy, its endless rules and obligations, and he had never truly felt at ease in the role of sovereign. With Wallis, he felt alive, understood, and free. And so he resolved to do what no monarch had ever done before. On the evening of December 11, 1936, Edward VIII addressed the nation in a live radio broadcast, his voice heavy but resolute. In words that would echo through history, he declared, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." With that, he signed the instrument of abdication, and his younger brother, the Duke of York, ascended the throne as King George VI, father of the present monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. Edward was given the title of Duke of Windsor and went into exile, first in France, then later in other parts of Europe. Wallis, who finalized her divorce shortly after the abdication, married Edward in June 1937 in a small ceremony in France. The royal family did not attend, a clear indication of the bitterness and disapproval that lingered. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they became known, lived largely outside Britain, moving in glamorous social circles, but always carrying the shadow of scandal with them. The story of Edward and Wallis is often romanticized as one of the greatest love stories of the 20th century, a king who gave up an empire for love. Yet it is also a story of conflict between personal happiness and public duty, between tradition and change. Many historians argue that Edward's abdication may have saved the monarchy, sparing it from a constitutional and moral crisis that could have weakened it at a fragile time, especially as Europe moved toward World War II. His brother George, though reluctant, became a stabilizing figure whose sense of duty and sacrifice restored faith in the crown during the darkest days of the war. Edward, for his part, lived a life of privilege, but also of exile. He was forever remembered as the king who would not reign. His relationship with Wallis remained controversial until the end. Some accused her of being manipulative, others of being ambitious, but to Edward she was simply the love of his life. When he died in 1972, he was buried at Windsor Castle, and when Wallis passed away in 1986, she was laid to rest beside him, at last united in the royal grounds they had once seemed so distant from. The abdication of Edward VIII remains a singular moment in British history. It raised profound questions about the monarchy's place in a changing world, about the balance between private desires and public responsibilities, and about the enduring power of love to challenge even the most rigid of institutions. For some, Edward was reckless, selfish, and unfit for the throne. For others, he was courageous, choosing love over power in a world where few dared to follow their heart so openly. What is certain is that his abdication forever altered the course of the monarchy, leading directly to the reign of George VI and then to that of Queen Elizabeth II, shaping the modern British monarchy we know today. And so, the story of Edward and Wallis is not merely a romantic tale. It is a defining chapter in the history of Britain, a moment when love and duty collided, and history was rewritten in the most unexpected way.